The clock on the wall of the Imperial Navy Ministry building in Tokyo ticked with mechanical precision. It was November 1944, and Admiral Soimu Toyoda sat hunched over a leather-bound intelligence report, his weathered hands trembling as he read the same line for the fourth time. The numbers stared back at him like a death sentence written in neat, bureaucratic columns. America had commissioned more aircraft carriers in the past 18 months than the Empire of Japan possessed operational aircraft. Not just fighter planes. Not just bombers. All aircraft combined. The silence in the war room stretched like a taut wire. Around the polished mahogany table, Japan's most decorated naval commanders sat frozen, their faces masks of disbelief and dawning horror. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, the architect of carrier warfare doctrine, slowly removed his wire-rimmed glasses and cleaned them with methodical movements, as if the problem lay with his vision rather than the reality before them. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, hero of Pearl Harbor, stared at his reflection in the table's surface, seeing perhaps for the first time the ghost of his former confidence. The typewriter in the corner had fallen silent. Even the secretary, a young lieutenant who had been dutifully recording the meeting's minutes, had stopped mid-sentence, his pen hovering over the page like a bird unsure where to land. The only sound was the relentless ticking of that clock, counting down to an inevitable conclusion none of them wanted to acknowledge. Don't let history be forgotten. Subscribe to the channel so these stories live on.
How do you fight an enemy with more floating fortresses than you have wings to fill the sky?
The report bore the seal of the Naval Intelligence Division, its authenticity beyond question. The numbers were precise, clinical, devastating. As of October 1944, the United States Navy operated 99 aircraft carriers of various classes. Fleet carriers, light carriers, escort carriers, a floating armada that dwarfed anything the world had ever seen. Japan, by contrast, possessed fewer than 4,000 operational aircraft across all services. The mathematics were simple, brutal, and final. America's carrier fleet alone represented more tonnage of steel than Japan's entire remaining navy. Admiral Toyoda finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. How is this possible? The question hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Vice Admiral Ozawa leaned forward, his eyes scanning the intelligence summary with the intensity of a man searching for salvation in scripture. "They're shipyards," he said slowly, "they're producing carriers faster than we can build destroyers." The revelation had been building for months, hidden in fragments of intercepted radio chatter, satellite reconnaissance photographs, and testimonies from captured American airmen. But seeing it assembled in black and white, with charts and graphs that traced America's industrial resurrection from Pearl Harbor's ashes, was like watching the sun rise on Judgment Day. In the steel cathedrals of American shipyards, a different kind of miracle was unfolding. At the Norfolk Naval Shipyard in Virginia, the sound of hammers rang out 24 hours a day. Women in coveralls worked alongside seasoned shipbuilders, their welding torches painting the darkness with streams of sparks that fell like stars. Mary Henderson, a former secretary from Richmond, had learned to weld aircraft carrier deck plates with the precision of a surgeon. Her husband was somewhere in the Pacific, serving aboard the USS Enterprise, and every rivet she drove was a prayer for his safe return. The rhythm of production was hypnotic, almost musical. Every 72 days, another Essex-class carrier slid down the ways into the Atlantic, its hull gleaming with fresh paint and possibility. The Independence-class light carriers took even less time. Converted from cruiser hulls, they emerged from dry docks like mechanical butterflies, ready to carry death across the Pacific. At the Kaiser shipyards in California, Henry Kaiser's revolutionary assembly line techniques had transformed carrier construction from craftsmanship into industrial symphony. Prefabricated sections arrived by rail from across the continent, fitted together with the efficiency of a jigsaw puzzle designed by gods of war. The workers took pride in their speed. Bill Morrison, a welder at Newport News, kept a running tally on his lunch box of the carriers he'd helped launch. By November 1944, his count stood at 17. "We built another floating city before breakfast," he would joke to his shift supervisor, unaware that his casual boast was literally reshaping the balance of global power. These weren't just ships, they were floating airbases, mobile nations carrying their own weather and creating their own horizons. Each Essex-class carrier stretched over 800 feet in length, displacing 36,000 tons of water when fully loaded. They carried up to 90 aircraft, complete machine shops, hospitals, and enough fuel and ammunition to wage war for months without resupply. The flight decks were expanses of steel larger than football fields, capable of launching and recovering aircraft around the clock in conditions that would ground land-based air forces. America was building these leviathans at a rate of one every 2.5 months. Meanwhile, in the shipyards of Kure and Sasebo, Japan's master craftsmen worked with increasing desperation. The carrier Shinano, converted from a Yamato-class battleship hull, represented the pinnacle of Japanese naval engineering. At 72,000 tons, she was the largest carrier ever built, a monument to Japanese ingenuity and determination. But she was also their last. By the time her construction began in earnest, the materials needed to complete her were becoming increasingly scarce. Steel allocations had been cut repeatedly, forcing designers to compromise on armor thickness and structural integrity. The contrast was stark and telling. Where American yards launched carriers in batches, Japan struggled to complete single vessels. The Unrai-class carriers, designed as simplified, mass-production vessels to compete with American construction rates, remained paper dreams. Only 3 were ever completed, and even these suffered from critical material shortages. The Unrai herself was completed without adequate armor plating, her magazines poorly protected, her fuel systems vulnerable to the smallest spark. Lieutenant Commander Minoru Genda, one of Japan's most brilliant naval aviation tacticians, had seen the writing on the wall months earlier. In his private diary, discovered decades later in the ruins of his family home, he wrote with chilling prescience, "We have built eagles without wings. Our carriers are magnificent, but what use is a nest without birds to fill it?" The entry was dated September 1944, 2 months before the intelligence report that would shatter the illusions of Japan's naval high command. The aircraft shortage was even more catastrophic than the carrier gap. Japan's aviation industry, once the wonder of the world, was collapsing under the weight of impossible demands and dwindling resources. The Mitsubishi factories that had produced the legendary Zero fighter were now struggling to maintain production of 50 aircraft per month. Quality control had deteriorated so severely that newly manufactured engines were failing within hours of their first flight. Pilots reported that their aircraft felt fragile, unreliable, like paper tigers designed more for ceremony than combat. In stark contrast, American aircraft factories were achieving production numbers that defied comprehension. The Grumman plant on Long Island was rolling F-6F Hellcats off the assembly line at the rate of 600 per month. The Chance Vought factory in Connecticut was producing F-4U Corsairs so quickly that they ran out of hangar space and had to park completed aircraft in endless rows across converted farmland. Pilots arriving for training often joked that they could smell the fresh paint and machine oil on aircraft that had been completed hours before their first flights. The statistics were overwhelming in their clarity. In 1944 alone, American factories produced over 96,000 military aircraft of all types. Japan, despite heroic efforts and the sacrifice of entire generations of skilled workers, managed fewer than 28,000. But even these numbers told only part of the story. American aircraft were growing more sophisticated, more reliable, more deadly with each production run. Japanese aircraft were becoming simpler, cheaper, more desperate, flying coffins disguised as fighter planes. Ensign Soburo Sokai, one of Japan's greatest fighter aces, returned from a mission over the Philippines in October 1944 with a bullet-riddled Zero and a story that would haunt his squadron mates. He had encountered a formation of American carriers launching aircraft at dawn, their flight decks alive with organized chaos as plane after plane roared into the sky. "I counted over 200 aircraft in the air at once," he reported to his commanding officer. "From a single task force. We couldn't put 200 operational aircraft into the sky from all of Japan if we wanted to." The psychological impact was as devastating as the material shortfall. Japanese pilots who had once dominated the Pacific skies now found themselves outnumbered 10-1 in every engagement. Training time had been slashed from 2 years to 6 months, then to 3 months, finally to a desperate 6 weeks of basic instruction before new pilots were thrown into combat against veteran American aviators who had been flying longer than their Japanese opponents had been alive. The intelligence report sitting on Admiral Toyoda's desk contained a section that particularly chilled the assembled naval leadership. American carrier task forces were operating with impunity within 200 miles of the Japanese home islands. Their reconnaissance flights photographed Japanese naval bases in broad daylight, mapping every ship, every building, every defensive installation with methodical precision. The Americans weren't just winning the war, they were documenting Japan's decline with the thoroughness of scientists studying a dying organism. Vice Admiral Tokeo Kurita, veteran of countless naval battles, voiced what everyone was thinking but no one wanted to say: they're not just fighting us. They're studying us. Learning our weaknesses while demonstrating their strength. His observation was more accurate than he realized. American intelligence services were indeed conducting a comprehensive analysis of Japanese naval capabilities, not out of fear or uncertainty, but out of scientific curiosity about the anatomy of defeat. The carrier USS Intrepid, operating off the coast of Honshu, launched reconnaissance flights that returned with photographs showing Japanese airfields nearly empty of aircraft. Hangar doors stood open, revealing vast empty spaces where squadrons of fighters should have been parked. The few aircraft visible in the photographs were often damaged, missing parts, or obviously inoperable. Intelligence analysts studying the images noted that Japan appeared to be cannibalizing aircraft for spare parts, a practice that indicated not just material shortage but systemic collapse. Support this work so the truth continues to reach people, and make sure you're subscribed. The human cost of this industrial disparity was becoming increasingly apparent in the testimonies of Japanese pilots who survived their missions. Flight Petty Officer Yasuo Kawara, shot down over Leyte Gulf and later repatriated, described the final months of Japanese naval aviation in terms that read like dispatches from another planet. "We were given aircraft that would not start, ammunition that would not fire, and fuel that barely carried us to the target," he recounted in his post-war memoir. "Our commanders told us we were fighting for the emperor, but we knew we were really fighting mathematics." The mathematics were indeed unforgiving. By December 1944, American carriers were launching more sorties in a single day than Japan could mount in an entire month. The USS Enterprise, USS Essex, USS Lexington, and dozens of their sister ships had become floating cities dedicated to the projection of air power on a scale that rewrote the rules of naval warfare. Each carrier task force possessed more combat aircraft than many entire air forces, supported by logistics trains that could sustain operations indefinitely. The technological gap was widening as rapidly as the numerical one. American aircraft were equipped with radar systems that allowed them to find and engage enemy aircraft in conditions of total darkness. Japanese pilots, many of whom had never seen radar equipment, found themselves under attack by enemies they couldn't see, couldn't locate, couldn't even comprehend. Night fighting, once an area of Japanese tactical superiority, had become a massacre as American night fighters stalked their prey with electronic precision. The industrial war had created a feedback loop of devastating efficiency. American carriers provided the platforms for American aircraft, which protected American ships, which carried American supplies to build more American carriers. Japan's remaining naval forces were caught in the opposite spiral. Fewer carriers meant fewer aircraft could be deployed, which meant less protection for the ships that carried the materials needed to build replacements that would never come. In the submarines operating beneath the Pacific's surface, American crews intercepted Japanese naval communications that painted a picture of an empire in terminal decline. Radio operators aboard the USS Tang recorded transmissions from Japanese commanders requesting aircraft that didn't exist, spare parts that couldn't be manufactured, and fuel that had already been consumed. One particularly poignant message, intercepted in November 1944, was from a Japanese carrier captain reporting to his superiors, "Request permission to scuttle vessel. No aircraft remain. No fuel for movement. Crew ready to die with honor." The reply, when it came 12 hours later, was equally telling: "Permission denied. Vessel will serve as stationary anti-aircraft platform. Conserve ammunition." The transformation of aircraft carriers into fixed gun positions represented perhaps the most symbolic acknowledgement of Japan's predicament. These vessels, designed to project air power across vast distances, were being reduced to oversized coastal defense batteries. The carrier Zuikaku, veteran of Pearl Harbor and the Coral Sea, spent her final months anchored in Tokyo Bay, her flight deck empty, her magazines nearly bare, her crew watching American B-29s pass overhead with impunity. American industrial capacity had achieved something unprecedented in military history, the ability to replace losses faster than they could be inflicted. Japanese submarines and aircraft that managed to sink American carriers discovered, to their horror, that their victories were temporary inconveniences rather than strategic achievements. The USS Princeton, sunk by a Japanese dive bomber in October 1944, was effectively replaced before her wreckage had settled on the ocean floor. Two new escort carriers slid down the ways at Kaiser shipyards on the same day the Princeton was lost, their construction having begun months earlier in anticipation of exactly this kind of attrition. The psychological warfare aspect of this production miracle was perhaps as important as its material impact. Japanese intelligence services, monitoring American radio broadcasts and captured documents, were forced to report to their superiors that American industrial output was not just exceeding Japanese capabilities, it was accelerating. Every month brought higher production numbers, more sophisticated equipment, and increasingly confident American commanders who spoke openly about having more ships than they knew what to do with. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, issued a directive in November 1944 that would have seemed like fantasy to his Japanese counterparts. He was complaining about having too many aircraft carriers, requesting permission to mothball some of the older escort carriers because they were cluttering up his harbors and requiring maintenance personnel who could be better utilized elsewhere. The idea of having too much naval power was so foreign to Japanese thinking that their intelligence analysts initially dismissed the report as disinformation. But the evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. American shipyards were launching carriers faster than American naval academies could train officers to command them. Flight schools were graduating pilots faster than aircraft factories could produce planes for them to fly. The entire American war machine had achieved a state of productive excess that turned warfare from a contest of attrition into a demonstration of industrial supremacy. The Japanese response to this reality took forms that ranged from desperate to delusional. Secret meetings in the Imperial Navy Ministry discussed fantastical schemes to somehow match American production through spiritual mobilization and efficiency improvements. Engineers proposed building carriers from wood and concrete, aircraft from bamboo and fabric. These weren't serious military plans, they were the fevered dreams of men who could no longer distinguish between possibility and prayer. More realistic commanders began preparing for what they privately called the final accounting. If Japan could not match America's industrial output, perhaps they could make the cost of victory so high that America would negotiate rather than complete the destruction. This thinking led directly to the kamikaze programs, the Fortress Islands, and the planned defense of the homeland that would have cost millions of lives on both sides. But even these desperate strategies were undermined by the carrier gap. Kamikaze aircraft needed bases from which to launch, fuel to reach their targets, and some reasonable chance of penetrating American defenses. Japanese suicide pilots found themselves facing American carrier task forces protected by layers of radar-guided fighters, surrounded by escort vessels bristling with anti-aircraft guns, and supported by logistics trains that could replace losses almost instantaneously. The final irony was that Japan's early success had contained the seeds of their ultimate defeat. The attack on Pearl Harbor had awakened American industrial capacity without destroying it. The sinking of American battleships had forced American naval doctrine to evolve around aircraft carriers, exactly the type of warfare that favored industrial capacity over tactical skill. Japan had inadvertently triggered the very kind of war they were least equipped to fight. By the winter of 1944, American carriers were operating in Japanese home waters with the casual confidence of tourists. The USS Yorktown launched reconnaissance flights over Tokyo Bay in broad daylight, photographing the Imperial Palace and the remains of Japan's once mighty fleet. The photographs were developed aboard the carrier and transmitted to Pearl Harbor the same day, part of a comprehensive intelligence picture that was being assembled with industrial thoroughness. Japanese radar operators, their equipment functioning intermittently due to parts shortages, tracked American aircraft formations with the helpless precision of astronomers observing an approaching comet. They could see the destruction coming, could calculate its trajectory and impact, but possessed no means to deflect or delay it. The American carriers had become instruments of scientific warfare, their operations planned with mathematical precision and executed with mechanical reliability. The diary of Captain Tomoichi Hara, one of Japan's most experienced destroyer commanders, provides a haunting perspective on these final months. Writing by candlelight in his cabin aboard the damaged destroyer Shiga, he described watching American carrier aircraft attack a Japanese convoy. They came in waves, like migrating birds following an ancient pattern. But these birds carried death, and their pattern was written in American factories, not in the stars. We shot at them with ammunition that had been saved for months, and they fell upon us with bombs that seemed as numerous as raindrops. The escort carrier USS Gambier Bay, part of a task force supporting the invasion of Leyte, launched and recovered aircraft throughout October 1944 with the routine efficiency of a city bus system. Her flight deck operations log, preserved in naval archives, records the departure and return of over 400 aircraft sorties in a single week. The pilots flying these missions were mostly reservists, citizen soldiers who had learned to fly in American colleges and flying clubs before the war. Many were younger than their aircraft, flying planes that had rolled off assembly lines in factories that hadn't existed when they were born. The contrast with Japanese operations was stark beyond comprehension. Japanese carriers that still possessed aircraft often couldn't launch them due to fuel shortages. When they could launch them, they frequently couldn't recover them due to damaged flight decks or missing arresting gear cables. Japanese pilots, many of whom had logged more combat hours than their American counterparts, found themselves flying aircraft that were mechanically unreliable, poorly armed, and effectively unsupported. The intelligence report that had triggered this crisis of confidence in Tokyo contained one final section that Admiral Toyoda had saved for last, hoping perhaps that delaying the inevitable would somehow change its import. American naval intelligence had intercepted and decoded Japanese communications indicating that Japan's remaining carriers were being stripped of their aircraft to provide spare parts for land-based air defense. The mighty Shokaku and Zuikaku, carriers that had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor, were being cannibalized to keep a handful of land-based fighters operational for a few more weeks. This wasn't strategic withdrawal or tactical repositioning, it was the systematic dismantling of Japanese naval aviation in real time. American code breakers were reading Japanese naval communications faster than some Japanese commanders, providing American task force commanders with intelligence so current and complete that they often knew Japanese battle plans before Japanese subordinate commanders received their orders. The technological superiority that America had achieved wasn't limited to quantity. American carriers were equipped with advanced radar systems that could track aircraft at distances exceeding 100 miles. Their fire control systems could coordinate defensive fire from multiple ships, creating overlapping fields of destruction that Japanese aircraft couldn't penetrate. American damage control procedures, refined through hard experience in earlier battles, meant that American ships could absorb punishment that would sink their Japanese counterparts and continue fighting. Perhaps most demoralizing of all, American carriers were being operated with a casualness that spoke to overwhelming superiority. Carrier task forces were dispatched to attack targets that would have required Japan's entire remaining fleet to assault. Individual American carriers were conducting operations that Japan could no longer mount with its entire naval aviation force. The scale of American operations had transcended tactical advantage and achieved something approaching strategic inevitability. Subscribe so these forbidden stories don't vanish again. The final meeting of Japan's Naval Supreme Council took place on a cold December morning in 1944. The participants included every senior naval officer still alive and capable of traveling to Tokyo. The agenda consisted of a single item, acknowledgement of mathematical reality. The numbers had been verified and re-verified. American industrial capacity had produced a Pacific fleet that was larger than the combined navies of all other nations in human history. Japan's remaining naval forces represented less than 5% of American strength and were declining daily. Admiral Toyoda spoke for the final time as head of the Imperial Navy. His words, recorded by Lieutenant Watanabe and discovered in Soviet archives decades later, carry the weight of absolute finality. We have fought the numbers and lost. We have fought the steel and lost. We have fought the sky itself and lost. The Americans have not just defeated our fleet, they have made our fleet irrelevant. The silence that followed lasted 17 minutes, timed by the clock that had measured Japan's descent from empire to ruin. When discussion finally resumed, it centered not on victory or even survival, but on the manner of defeat. How could an empire that had ruled the Pacific for less than 4 years gracefully acknowledge that its time was over? How could admirals who had planned to conquer Australia explain to their emperor that they couldn't defend their own harbors? The American carriers continued their methodical destruction of Japanese resistance with the efficiency of a natural force. Task Force 38, commanded by Admiral William Bull Halsey, operated with the confidence of men who knew that mathematics was on their side. Their battle plans were exercises in applied industrial superiority, calculated demonstrations of what happened when unlimited production capacity encountered finite resistance. Japanese pilots, when they could still find aircraft to fly, reported encounters with American formations that seemed to stretch beyond the horizon. Flight Petty Officer Kaneyoshi Muto, one of the last surviving Zero pilots, described his final mission in terms that read like science fiction. I climbed to intercept what I thought was a single enemy formation. At 20,000 feet, I realized I was looking at 3 separate carrier task forces, each one larger than our entire remaining fleet. The sky was filled with enemy aircraft like stars in the night sky. I had ammunition for perhaps 30 seconds of combat. They had more aircraft than I had bullets. The logistics supporting these massive formations defied comprehension. American supply ships, themselves larger than Japanese cruisers, arrived at predetermined coordinates with the precision of commuter trains. Fleet tankers pumped thousands of gallons of aviation fuel into carrier tanks while the ships maintained formation and flight operations continued uninterrupted. Supply ships transferred ammunition, spare aircraft engines, replacement pilots, and fresh food with the efficiency of floating factories. Japanese observers, when they could still conduct reconnaissance, reported American anchorages that looked like floating cities. Majuro Atoll, transformed into an American naval base, harbored more combat vessels than Japan possessed in total. Ulithi Atoll became home to a carrier concentration that represented more air power than existed in all of Europe. These weren't temporary deployments, they were permanent installations of American industrial might, mobile nations dedicated to the projection of overwhelming force. The human stories emerging from this industrial disparity were perhaps more telling than the statistics. American sailors wrote letters home complaining about the boredom of routine patrols in waters where Japanese resistance had become negligible. Japanese sailors wrote final letters to families they would never see again, their ships reduced to floating coffins by an enemy that seemed to possess unlimited resources and infinite patience. Seaman First Class Robert Morrison, serving aboard the carrier USS Ticonderoga, wrote to his sister in Kansas, "We launched more planes yesterday than I've seen in all my life." The flight deck was busy from before dawn to after dark, and we still had aircraft left over. The war out here feels like a parade more than a battle. We have so much of everything that the biggest challenge is finding places to store it all. His counterpart aboard the Japanese destroyer Yukikaze, Petty Officer Hiroshi Tanaka, wrote in his diary, "We have been at sea for 16 days without sighting a single friendly aircraft. Our radio operators intercept American communications all day long. They speak of aircraft losses the way we once spoke of ammunition expenditure. What they consider acceptable losses would represent our entire air force." The carrier USS Franklin, damaged by a Japanese kamikaze attack in March 1945, provided perhaps the most dramatic illustration of American industrial resilience. The ship absorbed 2 armor-piercing bombs that detonated among fueled and armed aircraft on her hangar deck. The resulting fires killed over 800 men and left the ship dead in the water, her flight deck a twisted ruin of melted steel and destroyed aircraft. Japanese radio broadcasts proclaimed the sinking of another American carrier, a small victory in an ocean of defeats. But the Franklin didn't sink. American damage control teams, trained in techniques developed through hard experience, contained the fires and saved the ship. More importantly, the Franklin's loss didn't affect American naval operations. Her scheduled missions were immediately assigned to other carriers, her aircraft complement was replaced from reserve pools, and her position in the battle line was filled by ships that had been held in reserve for exactly this purpose. The Japanese had achieved their most successful carrier attack in months, and the American response was to continue operations as if nothing had happened. This was the reality that Japanese naval commanders had been forced to confront in that Tokyo meeting room. They weren't just fighting a superior enemy, they were fighting an enemy for whom their greatest successes were minor inconveniences. American industrial capacity had achieved something unprecedented in military history, the ability to treat the instruments of war as consumable resources, to be expended and replaced with mechanical regularity. The final entries in Admiral Toyoda's personal log, written in the weeks before Japan's surrender, provide a haunting epitaph for Japanese naval aviation. "We built an empire on the wings of aircraft," he wrote, "and watched it disappear beneath the shadows of ships we could not sink, carrying planes we could not match, flown by pilots we could not defeat. The Americans did not conquer us through superior tactics or strategy. They simply built more of everything than we could destroy." The Japanese surrender ceremony aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay was attended by more American aircraft carriers than Japan had possessed at the height of its power. As General MacArthur spoke the words that ended the Pacific War, American carrier aircraft flew overhead in formations that blocked out the sun. The symbolism was intentional and complete. America had not merely won the war, it had redefined what victory meant in the industrial age. The echo of ship horns outlasted the roar of engines, and marked the day Japan knew it could never win.